He could have pulled a gun. He could have shattered the man's jaw. But Bumpy just stood there, calm as stone, while spit slid down his cheek. And 300 men watched him choose silence over war. The supper club pulsed with low jazz and thick cigar. Smoke. It was the kind of Harlem night where men wore their respect on their collars and women sipped gin with quiet elegance. Every corner of the room hummed with soft power politicians, numbers men, union bosses, and the ghosts of past betrayals no one dared speak aloud. Bumpy Johnson sat at the center table, just beneath the chandelier. Midnight suit, no hat, 2. Buttons undone like he wasn't afraid of anyone aiming for his chest. His lieutenants flanked him Junebug to the right, flash-eyed and rigid, and Leon Fish Simmons to the left, a slow-breathing giant with eyes that watched everything. They were waiting on the Italians. Not all of them, just one. Angelo Ricci strutted in like a stage actor. Big coat, red scarf, skin too pale for Harlem, but too rich to be denied entry. He was a mid-tier boss from the Bronx, but lately he'd been trying to plant flags where he didn't belong. Some thought he was foolish. Others thought he was fearless. Bumpy knew better. He was desperate. Angelo didn't shake hands. He didn't sit. He didn't nod. He walked right up to Bumpy's table and smiled like a man holding a loaded confession. "Evenin', Johnson," he said loud enough to quiet the nearest tables. "Heard you run things around here. Figured I'd see what kind of king runs from a real crown." Junebug's knuckles twitched. Fish leaned forward, calm but ready. Bumpy didn't move. "You looking for a seat, Mr. Ricci?" Bumpy asked, voice calm as still water. "I was," Angelo said. "But then I realized," he stepped closer, "some kings just pretend they're thrones. So I brought my own chair." He didn't sit. He didn't blink. Instead, he spat right in Bumpy's face. The glob hit just below the eye and slid slow down the cheek, like time itself had stopped to watch. There was no gunfire. No shouting. No lunging. No slamming of chairs or broken bottles. Just silence. Bumpy's eyes never left Angelo's. He didn't wipe the spit away. He didn't say a word. He just stood. The club held its breath as he stepped around the table, his shoes echoing on the hardwood like quiet drums. His men didn't follow. No one moved. Bumpy walked right past Ricci. Not a glance back, not a pause, just silence and power. Outside, the Harlem night greeted him like an old friend. He lit a cigarette with slow fingers and leaned against a black car parked across the street. Junebug caught up first, seething. "Boss, you want me to?" "No." Fish exited slower, nodding to the doorman who'd already seen too much. "No?" Junebug snapped. "He spit on you, Bump, in front of everybody. That ain't just disrespect, that's war." Bumpy exhaled smoke and finally wiped his cheek. He didn't flinch at the word. "It's not war," he said. "Not yet." Fish looked over. "You sure the people see it that way?" They saw everything they needed to. Junebug couldn't hide the rage in his voice. "You let it happen. That ain't you." Bumpy turned, slowly, measured. "I didn't let anything happen." He stared down Lenox Avenue, quiet now. Cold wind rustling paper near the gutter. A car engine rumbled in the distance. Somewhere a saxophone cried from an upstairs window. "Chose not to react," Bumpy said, voice heavy with something deeper than anger. "That man just told me everything I need to know." Junebug shook his head. "What do we do now?" "We wait." "For what?" "For Harlem to answer." Bumpy flicked the cigarette into the street, turned, and got into the car. As it pulled away, the music inside the club stuttered back to life. But something had shifted. Inside, Ricci laughed loud and ordered champagne. Outside, the street felt like the calm before a storm that had already decided where it would strike. By morning, Harlem already knew The barbershops heard it first told in whispers between straight razor passes and cigarette flicks. Bumpy didn't lift a finger. Ricci spat dead in his face. He just walked away. Each time the story was told, the silence afterward said more than the words "by noon." It had traveled through the soul food kitchens, church basements, backroom dice games, and schoolyard fences. Mothers muttered it while bagging okra. Old men paused their checkers. Pastors sat a little heavier behind the pulpit, not ready to decide whether restraint meant weakness or something else entirely. On 138th and Malcolm X Boulevard, kids who once saluted Bumpy with 2 fingers to their brow now asked each other in low voices, "You think he's done?" That was the question circling the blocks like smoke. Was Bumpy Johnson losing Harlem? At Sylvia's Diner, across from the MTA lot, 2 off-duty cops sat at the counter nursing coffee and waffles. "Johnson's done," the younger one muttered. "Can't let no dago do that in public and just stroll out." The older one didn't answer. He stirred his coffee, slow. "You ever seen a man walk out a spit?" He finally asked. The rookie didn't get it. He didn't fight back. He didn't have to, the older cop said. He let Ricci spit. And now Ricci's trapped in it. At the Palmetto Social Club, where the black elite of Harlem held private poker nights and quiet conversations about union shifts and backdoor deals, an emergency meeting formed without invitation. Preachers, shopkeepers, union heads, men who owed Bumpy and men who feared him. Willis Monroe, the Harlem Transit rep, tapped his glass to call the room quiet. "Gentlemen," he said, voice unsteady, "we need clarity. There's concern." "Concern?" asked Mr. Lee from the garment union, tightening his tie. Ricci walked into Bumpy's house, spit on him. "That ain't concern. That's collapse," Monroe nodded. "Exactly. If Bumpy won't respond, we have to consider what that means for Harlem's safety. For our workers." Silence. Then a voice. From the back, old man Ellsworth, once a bootlegger, now just a wrinkled chair with a sharp tongue. "You boys forgot who you talking about." Monroe bristled. "We're talking about Harlem." "No," Ellsworth said. "You're talking like Harlem forgot. But Harlem don't forget silence. Harlem studies it." The room fell quiet again, because deep down they all remembered what came after Bumpy, went silent in 51, and again in 57, and last winter when that southern crew tried to move stolen sugar through Brooklyn and vanished by sunrise. Bumpy didn't shout. He didn't send messages. He just waited. And Harlem always watched. That night, Bumpy's brownstone was still. He sat alone in the kitchen. No suit jacket, sleeves rolled up, staring at a steaming cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Mame stood in the doorway. She'd seen that look before. "You gonna tell me what happened?" He didn't look up. "You heard." "I heard a man disrespected my husband in front of the city." He exhaled. "And?" She stepped closer. "And I'm waiting to see what kind of man I'm married." Bumpy looked up, eyes heavy. "I'm the kind that don't swing wild in public." He stood. "I'm the kind that don't let my people get dragged into a war just to satisfy my pride." He stepped past her slow. "But I'm also the kind of man who counts to 48 and then doesn't have to explain himself ever again." Mame didn't follow. She didn't need to. She just whispered, "Don't come back with blood on your shoes." Down on 125th Street, Junebug paced outside the Victory Tap Room, ignoring the cold. "You really think he's gonna do nothin'?" one of the younger lieutenants asked. Junebug didn't answer. He just stared across the street, where Ricci's car was still parked crooked outside the old VFW hall he'd claimed for his little crew. "He ain't doing nothin'," the kid muttered again, this time like a dare. Junebug turned slow. "You? Been with us how long, kid?" 8 months. Junebug spat into the gutter. You ever seen me nervous? The kid shook his head. Junebug nodded toward the street lamp. Keep watch. When that car don't leave tonight, you'll know what silence means. By dawn, two things had become clear. 1. Bumpy still hadn't moved. 2. The Italians had gotten louder. Ricci's men were now posted at 3 clubs. One of Bumpy's cigar runners got jumped on Lennox. Word was spreading that Ricci had tamed the King of Harlem. But Harlem was watching something else. It was watching who didn't show up. The gamblers, the protection collectors, the bootleg liquor runners, all missing. 2 sandwich shops closed early. One numbers lady moved her operation to the Bronx overnight. And on the 3rd morning, a preacher stood in front of his silent congregation and sighed, "We are walking through a storm that hasn't thundered yet." In the back row, a man in a tan coat leaned forward and said, 48 hours is tomorrow. And Harlem exhaled, because it understood now this wasn't hesitation. It was countdown. Angelo. Ricci woke up smiling. That alone should have scared him. He stretched in the silk sheets of the apartment he'd taken over on Arthur Avenue, the Bronx light slipping in through half-drawn curtains. The city felt different to him now, lighter, like gravity had loosened its grip. He had spit on the King of Harlem. And nothing happened. No bullets through windows, no midnight knocks, no whispers carried by scared messengers. Just silence. Ricci poured himself espresso and laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed too loud in the room. "They're scared," he said to no one. "That's what silence sounds like." By noon, he made sure everyone else believed it too. The Italian Social Club on 116th Street buzzed with confidence. Doors wide open. Music loud. Too loud. It was the sound of men daring fate to do something about them. Ricci sat at the head table, legs spread, coat draped like a flag. Around him were 6 men soldiers, not thinkers. Men who mistook noise for dominance. "You see their faces last night?" One of them said, biting into a sausage. "Harlem boys don't know what to do without their king barking orders." Ricci smirked. "Because he ain't a king. He's a statue. Look strong until you push." Another man leaned in. "Word is, his crew's confused." Ricci laughed. "Good. Confused men don't fight back. They wait for permission that never comes." He lifted his glass. "To Harlem," he said. "Open territory." Glasses CLINKED. None of them noticed. The man across the room who didn't drink, he wore a janitor's jacket, kept his eyes low. Left early. Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was counting. Not on his fingers, on his city. He walked the streets alone that afternoon. No entourage, no show. Just a man in a dark coat, nodding at shopkeepers, stopping to speak with old women who'd known him since he was barefoot and angry. "How you holding up, Miss Lila?" he asked one. She looked at him, eyes sharp. "I'm fine, Ellsworth. That was his name before he was Bumpy. You?" she asked. "I'm right where I need to be." She studied him, then nodded. "Good, because the wrong men are allowed today." Bumpy moved on. At a butcher shop, the owner slid him a wrapped parcel without charge. "At church tomorrow," the man said quietly, not looking up. "They won't be there." Bumpy didn't ask who. He didn't need to. The first man disappeared just before sunset. No screams. No blood. Just absence. Vincenzo Littleving Marino left the social club at 6:40 p.m. He never made it home. His coat was found folded on the back seat of his car. Wallet inside. Watch missing. Ricci heard about it at dinner. Probably ran off, he scoffed. These kids get cold feet. But something in the way the messenger spoke, the way his voice dipped, made Ricci uncomfortable. By midnight, a second man failed to report in, then a third. Phones rang unanswered. Cars. Stayed parked. Doors stayed locked. Richie paced. You said. They were scared, one of his men muttered. They are, Richie snapped. This is a bluff. But even as he said it, his voice cracked. 40-8 hours is a long time when you're waiting for proof. Richie didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the building creak, to the distant hum of traffic, to the sound of his own breathing growing louder with every unanswered call. At 4:12 a.m. The phone rang. He grabbed it. Nothing. Just breathing on the other end. Slow. Measured. Then the line went dead. Richie sat there, sweat slick on his back, heart pounding. This is nothing, he whispered. But he didn't believe it. By morning, Harlem knew. 4 Italians were gone. No bodies found. No police reports. No witnesses. Just empty seats where men used to sit. At the social club, chairs stayed pushed in. Plates untouched. Music off. The neighborhood felt like it had stepped around something invisible but deadly. Richie arrived late, face pale, eyes darting. Where's Carlo? He demanded. No one answered. Where's Frankie? Silence. Richie slammed his hand on the table. Answer me. A man finally spoke, barely above a whisper. They ain't answering phones. Richie swallowed. He had crossed the line, not with violence. With noise. He had mistaken restraint for fear, silence for weakness, community for chaos. He had forgotten something essential. Bumpy Johnson didn't need permission to move. Harlem moved with him. Across the river, Bumpy sat in a quiet back room, playing chess with a man who hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. Bumpy moved a pawn. The man hesitated. Your move, Bumpy said. The man finally looked up. You sure this ends clean? Bumpy didn't smile. It already did. He stood, buttoned his coat. The loud ones disappear first, he said. The rest learn. Outside, Harlem breathed easier, because when Bumpy Johnson chose silence, it wasn't mercy. It was structure. And structure doesn't shout. Sunday came quiet. Harlem dressed like it always did for church-pressed suits, patent leather shoes, hats, wide enough to cast shade over whole pews. But this morning, the air held something different. Not fear, not tension. Something more ancestral. Reverence. People spoke softer. They greeted each other with more deliberate eyes. And when the doors of St. Augustine's opened just after 10, they didn't just look for the choir or the pastor. They looked for Bumpy, and when he appeared alone, in a charcoal suit with no tie, Harlem didn't cheer. It simply parted. Men stepped aside without instruction. Women paused their conversations. And children, usually so restless before the service, stood still and watched the King of Harlem walk down the aisle without a word. He chose a seat near the front, third row, just beneath the stained glass window of the crucifixion. Junebug stood against the back wall. Fish, too. Neither of them spoke because they weren't there to guard him. They were there to witness. The sermon wasn't about vengeance. The preacher was too wise for that. It was about order. He spoke of David, of patience, of how strength doesn't always need to scream. And then, without naming names, he spoke of chairs. Sometimes, the preacher said, pacing slow, a man walks into a room and chooses not to fill a chair that he could have taken by force. Sometimes that man waits. He stopped, eyes scanning the crowd. And sometimes the Lord removes chairs altogether. The words hit different, because 4 chairs in that congregation back left corner, always reserved for Richie's men, were empty. No one had dared sit in them. No one ever would again. After the benediction, the congregation filed out slow. Some brushed past Bumpy with nods, some with the quiet touch of their fingertips on his shoulder. No words. They weren't thanking him. They were aligning with him. Junebug waited by the curb. You want the car? Bumpy shook his head. I'm walking. He made his way down Lenox Avenue, past the florist, past the newsstand, past the corner. Where he'd first seen a man shot for $15 back in '32, nothing about the city had changed. But everything had shifted. Kids peeked from apartment windows. Barbers stepped out of their shops to nod. A butcher lifted his blood-stained hand in salute. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just acknowledgement. Half a mile away, the social club Richie had once used to stage his entrance into Harlem sat locked. Its windows were unlit. Its chairs were turned upside down. The awning, once polished, now sagged in the cold wind. And taped to the door, a plain sheet of paper with a single word: closed. Inside a diner nearby, Richie's last remaining soldier sat alone in the corner booth. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't called home. He just stared out the window at the Harlem streets that used to ignore him, and now wouldn't even acknowledge him. A man slid into the booth across from him. No warning. No sound. He was young, clean, nothing threatening about him except for the silence he brought with him. The Italian stiffened. What do you want? The man placed a small envelope on the table. Inside, a photo. 4 chairs, empty. And beneath it, one sentence in soft pencil: you may leave. Alone. The man stood, walked out, never looked back. The Italian stayed seated for a long, long time. Back at the brownstone, Mame was in the kitchen stirring collard greens. She didn't look up when Bumpy entered. Didn't speak. She just said, "I assume Harlem's still standing." He loosened his cuffs. "It is? And the Italians?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She passed him a glass of sweet tea and sat across the table. "You ever think about what it costs you? Holding back?" Bumpy leaned back in the chair. "Every day." "Then why do it?" He studied her face. Then the room. Then the city beyond the window, because I ain't just holding it for me. Monday morning came like nothing had happened. Taxis still honked. Newspapers still hit the stoop. Smokers still lit up on fire escapes, watching the city come alive with the same rhythm it always did. But Harlem knew, because Harlem doesn't wait for headlines. Harlem watches who walks the avenues and who doesn't. That morning, Bumpy Johnson walked alone, again. No guards, no guns showing. Just him in a black wool coat, collar turned up against the January wind. People noticed something different about the way he walked. Not faster, not slower, just ... complete. Like a man who no longer had to be seen to be known. The Italian flags were gone from the club windows. The muscle cars had vanished from the corners. And most telling of all, no one ever said Richie's name again. At the corner of 125th and Adam Clayton Powell, Bumpy stopped at the shoeshine stand. Old Willie was still there, brushing leather like he had for 3 decades. He looked up and smiled. "Ain't seen you walking these blocks solo in a long time." Bumpy sat down. "Thought I'd remind the streets who they belong to." Willie started buffing. "They remember, Bump. Even when you quiet, they remember." Across the street, a group of teens leaned against a stoop, eyes tracking him. Not with fear, not with challenge. With awe. One of them nodded slow and whispered, "He didn't have to do nothing." Another added, "That's how you know he did everything." Later that day, a small crowd gathered outside the storefront of the Old Victory Taproom. Word had spread that Bumpy was going to reopen it, not as a gambling den, not as a front, but as a public meeting space. A place for neighborhood men to talk. Real talk. Books. Business. Futures. Some called it soft. Some called it brilliant. Junebug stood at the back, watching the workers repaint the door. "You ever gonna tell me what happened to Richie?" he asked. Bumpy didn't answer. Just watched the new sign being hoisted. Harlem Unity Hall. Fish chuckled behind them. "That your answer?" Bumpy exhaled. That's Harlem's answer. Later that evening, the FBI paid a visit. Agent Miller, mid-40s, Southern accent too polished to be real. He didn't knock hard. Didn't need to. Men like him never do. Mame opened the door but didn't invite him in. He's in the study. Miller entered like he owned air. Bumpy didn't look up from his desk. You need something, Agent? Miller smiled. Just wondering how 4 Italian nationals disappear without a peep. No violence reported. No calls made. No suspects. Bumpy poured himself a small glass of bourbon. You got a theory? Got a hunch, Miller said. You got an alibi? Bumpy sipped. I was at church. Miller paused. All day? Bumpy finally looked up. Harlem don't need violence to clean itself, he said. It just needs time. Miller studied him. You're not as loud as you used to be. Bumpy smiled. You're just finally learning how to listen. The agent left without pressing further because even the federal government knew Harlem didn't speak without purpose. 3 days later, Harlem threw a block party. No flyers. No permits. Just speakers pulled onto stoops, kids dancing in the street, and grills firing up ribs like the neighborhood had survived something ancient. Junebug sat on a folding chair, watching Bumpy slow dance with Mame under string lights. You think the Italians will try again? He asked. Fish didn't even look up, not the smart ones. They'll send someone else, Junebug muttered. Fish finally turned. Then they'll disappear too. At the end of the night, Bumpy stood in front of the old courthouse steps, looking out over a street that was laughing again. He didn't say a speech, didn't raise a fist, didn't declare himself a winner. He just stood there. Quiet man, a present man, and Harlem saw him. Really saw him, because power isn't always in the punch. Sometimes it's in the chair that never gets filled again. Sometimes it's in the 4 seats no one sits in. Sometimes it's in the name no one dares speak. And sometimes, like this night, it's in a man who says nothing because he doesn't have to. Months passed. Winter thawed. Easter came and went. Spring rolled in with saxophones on stoops and perfume in the air. The city moved on. But Harlem remembered. Not the blood, because there was none. Not the war, because it never started. What Harlem remembered was how it had been prevented. With silence. With precision. With discipline disguised as patience. Ricci's name never appeared in the papers. No obituary. No police file. No missing persons report. Just gone like a shadow swallowed by a darker room. To outsiders, it was a mystery. To Harlem, it was a warning. No more crews tested boundaries that year. No street-level soldiers carved up corners without permission. Even the crooked cops kept their distance. Something had shifted, not just in the streets, but in the hierarchy. The code had been rewritten, and at the top sat a man who never raised his voice. Inside the Johnson brownstone, things were quieter too. Mame planted roses that spring. Bumpy started reading again, real books, not ledgers. The old ones. Marcus Garvey, Baldwin, Sun Tzu, even poetry. He wasn't softening. He was sharpening. Inward. And Harlem, without knowing why, stood a little taller. Young men who once idolized loudness started noticing something else. Stillness. They watched how Bumpy entered rooms, how people stepped aside without being told, how shopkeepers greeted him not with fear, but with alignment. One of those young men, tall and quiet, would later say, I used to think respect came from how hard you hit. Then I watched Bumpy walk through silence and realized power don't need an echo. That boy would go on to organize one of Harlem's biggest community food drives. In Bumpy's name. UNREQUESTED. Unpublicized. Just done. One night, Bumpy sat on a park bench outside the Apollo Theater, looking up at the marquee lights. Fish sat beside him, sipping from a paper cup. They didn't talk much anymore. They didn't have to. After a while, Fish said, "You ever think about what would have happened if you hit him back?" Bumpy didn't answer right away. Then we'd be at funerals. Fish nodded. But folks wanted that. They wanted closure, Bumpy said. What I gave them was order. A silence. Then Fish asked, "And what did it cost you?" Bumpy looked out over 125th. Everything that don't matter. By the end of that year, the chairs in St. Augustine's were all filled again, except those 4 in the back left corner. They stayed empty. No one spoke about it. No one needed to. Even the pastor dusted them without question. Some spaces weren't meant to be refilled. Some absences are sacred. The city would go on to crown other kings, some louder, some younger, some reckless enough to die fast. But Bumpy's legend was different. It moved underground, spoken in whispers behind backroom deals, taught quietly in barbershop chairs and pool halls. Don't start nothin', but don't leave nothin' unfinished. You ain't got to roar if your silence means war. Real kings don't take revenge. They take control. And in time, even the government would forget what had happened that week. But Harlem never did, because power isn't remembered by what it destroys. It's remembered by what it preserves. And in those 48 silent hours, Bumpy Johnson preserved Harlem. Not with fists, not with bullets, but with unshakable command. And the streets? They never forgot who taught them that.